So we will now move to our next presenter. Babatoni, I see that you're here, and is Atlantis joining you still?
So this is actually Atlantis.
Oh, there she is.
How are you?
Wonderful.
Good. So
Okay, great. Wonderful. So I'm trying to remember the order. I believe Babatoni is going to be via video, and then Atlantis, you will do a presentation, a PowerPoint presentation, correct?
correct. Yes.
Great. We can't hear you. Can you unmute yourself? But I'm gonna do the quick read of the bio for Babatoni, and then you can introduce yourself and take it from there. Okay?
Okay. Great. Thank you.
Great. Anthony Browder is an author, publisher, cultural historian, artist, and educational consultant. He is a graduate of Howard and has lectured extensively throughout the United States and 5 continents. Tony Browder is the founder and director of IKG Cultural Resources and has devoted 38 years researching ancient Egyptian history, science, philosophy, and culture. He has traveled to Egypt or Kemet 58 times since 1980, and maybe more than that by now, and is currently the AHSA Restoration Project Director, which is funding the excavation and restoration of 2 25th dynasty tombs of Kushite noblemen on the west bank of Luxor, Egypt. Anthony Browder is the first African American to fund and coordinate an archaeological dig in Egypt and has led 25 missions to Egypt since 2009. He has authored or co-authored 12 publications, which are currently used in classrooms around the world, and is dedicated to the positive portrayal of the worldwide African experience. Mr. Browder's 3 decades of study have led him to the conclusion that ancient Africans were the architects of civilization and developed the rudiments of what has become the scientific, religious, and philosophical backbone of mankind. It is from this framework that IKG has concentrated its research and disseminated its findings. Of course, one of his proudest accomplishments is the maturation and education and loving of his daughter, Atlantis Browder, who has been following in his footsteps, but is also an educator in her own right. I know she works with BEN, a Black Educational Network, and is also educating young people around the US on African history and culture, as well as her work in Kemet with her father. So I'm going to turn over the rest of the presentation to Atlantis, and she will share with us what she and her father has for us today. Atlantis, welcome.
Thank you so much, Mama Afi. Greetings to everyone here, virtually as well as in the physical space on the continent. Nana Kofi, thank you for your presentation. I enjoyed it and definitely learned a lot as well. I'm very grateful to be here, and particularly to be here instead of with my dad, but in place of my dad. He did, as Mama Afia said, create a video. Unfortunately, he is on the road traveling to a memorial service for Ali Salahuddin, the founder of the Dessert Club. So I do want to acknowledge him and dedicate this presentation to him, because he for sure highlights the topic of our presentation, which is modeling the significance of Kemetic studies, particularly for youth. So what I will do now is go ahead and share my screen so that I can share my father's video. He has pre-recorded his presentation, and then I will follow behind that with my presentation about how we, through IKG, model the significance of studying Kemetic history and culture. All right, and let me know if everyone can hear the volume.
Greetings, family. I'm Anthony Browder, and I'm proud to participate in this PANAFEST Colloquium, which is being co-sponsored by the African Heritage Studies Association. My presentation this afternoon is actually a two-part presentation that I'm doing with my daughter, Atlantis Browder. I'll be doing the first part, and she will follow up with the second part. One point that I like to stress right now is that my portion of my presentation is actually pre-recorded, as I am currently in Philadelphia attending the homegoing services of a dear colleague of mine who recently passed on this past Thursday. So I'll be doing the first part of the presentation via this recording, and my daughter will follow through with a live presentation, and she also will be able to answer questions for both of our presentations from the audience. So let me just jump in, share my screen, and begin my talk. I want to dedicate my talk this afternoon to my dear friend Ali Salahuddin, who was the founder of the African Genesis Incorporated. It was an organization which Ali and his wife Helen founded over 20 years ago, in which they were teaching African and African-American history to African children. It was part of a 2-year study program, and at the conclusion of that 2-year period, they would actually take these students on trips to Egypt, to Ghana, to Brazil, to visit where African people have lived throughout this planet. They have been responsible for taking over 5,000 African-American children and their chaperones to Africa. So, and I've been blessed to have worked with Ali and his wife Helen for well over 20 years. And I have to be at his homegoing services today in order to pay my respects to his family, and also to reinforce the importance, the value of this work. It is so critically important, and I'm proud to have dedicated over 40 years of my life to doing similar work. And so what I'd like to be able to do is to share with you my slides, which will allow me to do my portion of the presentation. And I want to talk about the brief history of my search for African history in the context of modeling Kemetic culture for African youth. This is the first part of a 2-part presentation. My daughter will complete this presentation with her follow-up, and hopefully our presentation this afternoon will help to reinforce the value of knowing ancient African history and teaching that history to all people of African descent wherever they may be. We focus primarily on our youth, but it's also critically important that adults be reintroduced to their African history and culture for obvious reasons. The obvious reason being that our history has been stolen, it's been lost, it's been appropriated, and the only way that we can begin to move forward as a people is to know where we have been in the past. My journey began in 1977 when I met Dr. Ivan Van Sertima, who had just published his book, They Came Before Columbus, The African Presence in America. And as I listened to Dr. Van Sertima present information about his work, documenting the fact that Africans built ships, navigated the Mediterranean Sea and the Atlantic Ocean, and made multiple visits to the Americas, principally in Mexico, between 1200 and 600 BC. So we're talking about Africans coming to the New World over 2,500 years before Christopher Columbus was born. This information was groundbreaking for me, but what really shifted my thinking was when Dr. Van Sertima said that these Africans had traveled to the New World from Egypt and they were Black. This was the first time in my life that anyone had ever informed me that the ancient Egyptians were Black, were in fact Africans. This is in 1977. I graduated from college 3 years earlier, and I thought I knew a lot about history and culture. I thought I was smart until I sat in the audience and listened to Dr. Van Sertima talk about an aspect of African history that I had no awareness of. And that began my journey into studying history, because what I discovered, what I realized at that moment was that the people and educational systems that I had trusted to educate me, to teach me about the world, to teach me about who I was and my place in the world, they had failed me. They failed me not because it was an intentional act on their part. They failed me because they only knew what they had been taught. And there's information which has intentionally been withheld from people of African ancestry. Why? Because what you know about yourself determines your capacity to manifest your full glory and power. What you can accomplish is based on what your ancestors have accomplished. We are tethered to them. And when we are separated from our ancestors, then we waste a lot of time trying to figure out who we are and our proper place in the world. So it was meeting Dr. Van Sertima in 1977 that I became aware of who I was as a person of African ancestry, what my ancestors had done, and I began to do a deeper dive into the study of that history and culture. Van Sertima had shared a number of images of heads. Some of these heads are 7 feet tall, 15 feet in diameter, heads that Africans had carved of themselves when they were part of the ruling family among the Olmec people in Mexico between 1200 and 600 BC. There are over 20 of these heads all throughout Mexico, and they feature images of distinctly African men, even though some historians, some white historians and scholars have said that the reason why these statues have broad noses and thick lips is because the people who created them didn't have the tools to make thin noses and thin lips. And if you look at the image of the Olmec head in the lower right-hand corner, you'll notice this is an image of the back of the head, and you'll notice 7 braids, cornrows. So it was Van Sertima who distinguished some of the key features of these Olmec heads and said that they were wearing leather helmets that were similar to the leather helmets that were worn by Nubian soldiers, ancient Nubian or Kushite soldiers of the Nile Valley going back thousands of years ago. And so that prompted my search for African history. And this search for African history is so critically important because if you don't know your history, if you don't know where you've come from, you have a difficult time trying to determine where you are at the present moment and where you can go. I want to share with you briefly another example of the theft of African history and culture. The photograph that you're looking at is a photograph of the U.S. Customs House, which is located in Lower Manhattan, right on the Hudson River. This building was created in the early 20th century, and it features 4 statues which represent the 4 continents. These statues were created by Daniel Chester French, who was one of the foremost sculptors in America at the turn of last century. He is the sculptor responsible for creating the statue of Abraham Lincoln in the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C. For the purposes of my discussion today, I want to focus on 3 of the continents, America, Europe, and Africa, to show you the subtle messages that are incorporated in these sculptures, which tell the history and culture of a people. Here's the image of America, and you notice that America is depicted as a female. All of the continents are female because symbolically and metaphorically, women give birth to people who give birth to nations, who give birth to cultures and civilizations. So all of the 7 continents are named after women. So America, we see here, is holding a torch in her right hand. That torch is symbolic of light or enlightenment and knowledge. We see that she has laying in her lap sheaths of corn, which represents her ability to feed the people of her nation. And this is what America represents to herself and the world: enlightenment and this incredible capacity for knowledge, for intellectual freedom, and agriculture, growth, and development. The next image we see is that of Europe, and Europe is represented by Athena, the Roman goddess of war, wisdom, power, and philosophy. And so what I want you to notice is that Minerva, the Roman goddess of Minerva, is named after the Greek goddess Athena, same personality who represents the same attributes. You notice that Athena has her left arm resting on a book. A book is symbolic of knowledge. You'll also notice that this book is open. An open book represents, metaphorically in art and sculpture, represents the application of knowledge, the practical application of knowledge. And I want you to notice even further that this open book is resting on a globe of the world, which in this instance represents Europeans, specifically the Romans, using the knowledge that they've gained in order to conquer, control, and dominate the world, all of the nations that have come under their influence. So we see here a clear example of how Europeans have used knowledge in order to control the nations that they conquer. Now let's go and look at the representation for Mother Africa. Yes, and I can hear you gasping, even though this is a recording. We see that Africa, Mother Africa, is nude from the waist up. We see that she is in a slump position, which indicates that she is either sleeping or unconscious. And in this instance, to be asleep or to be unconscious is a metaphor for being dead, being mentally dead, historically dead. And so this represents the condition of African people to some extent on the continent, and African people in the diaspora who've been stripped from their homeland, whose memories have been erased, who are, as a people, culturally dead, are not in a position to do what other cultures, other people who have retained their cultures have been able to do. And you'll notice here that Africa has been, she's been ravaged. She has been physically abused and culturally abused. Her resources have been taken. Her greatest resource is her people, but her gold, her diamonds, her ivory have been taken in order to make Europe wealthy. And as a consequence, Africa and African people are unable to defend themselves or defend their nation. And you notice that the arms of Mother Africa rest on two images of royalty and power. The lion, which is symbolic of kingship patterns in the continent. And we see a sphinx-like figure, which represents the great pharaohs, the great kings of Kemet, Egypt, which is very much a part of African history and culture. And so as profoundly earth-shattering as these three images are, what is even more important is what is on the side of each of these images, as I'll share with you here in this image. Here we see Africa. On the side of Mother Africa, we see a figure here who is cloaked and who is holding something in this vessel. I submit to you, brothers and sisters, that this figure is symbolic of Europeans who have come into Africa and who have stolen the knowledge of Africa, who have stolen the people of Africa, and have stolen the resources of Africa. As a consequence, Africa and African people are unconscious, unable to defend themselves or their resources. And so if we look at Europe, what we see behind the symbol of Minerva, who represents Europe, is this thief who stole the knowledge of Africa, is now in Europe, and he's now reading from a book. He is now studying the knowledge that he has stolen from Africa and using that knowledge to advance their conquest of the world. And if we move to the image behind America, we'll see here that same thief now has the covers pulled off of him, and he's now free to move throughout North America, South America, Central America, and every island in the Caribbean. So what we are witnessing here through the work of Daniel Chester French are sculptures which describe in physical detail the theft of African people African history and African culture, and how Europeans have used this knowledge and the power gained from stealing knowledge and resources from Africa to empower themselves. And what you will notice is behind the thief in America is a vessel similar to the vessel he was holding when he was stealing the knowledge of Africa. So this building is the U.S. Customs House. It's located in Lower Manhattan, right near Wall Street. So what does all of this mean? What this represents is the fact that African people have been the first and greatest victims of cultural identity theft. Others have stolen our knowledge and used that knowledge to lift themselves up while saying that Africans have never made any major contributions whatsoever to history, culture, or to civilization. And then they stole African people and then colonized Africa and are still to this very day stealing the resources of Africa in order to empower themselves. How do we change this situation? We change this situation by beginning the process of studying ourselves. I've been traveling to Africa for 40 years now. 40 years, I've been traveling to Egypt. I've been to Ghana about 7 or 8 times. I've made around 62 trips to Egypt over the last 40 years and over 70 trips to Africa within that same period of time. And as a result of my studies, I have authored 14 books, authored or co-authored a number of 14 books. But the most important part of the work that I've been doing in Africa over the last 40 years is work that I've been doing specifically for the last 13 years. And that work is we have been funding and actively participating in archaeological excavations in Egypt. We are the first people and only people of African ancestry to fund and fully participate in an archaeological excavation in Egypt. That archaeological excavation allows me to focus my attention on what I have learned about ancient African civilization, ancient Nile Valley culture and civilization, which reached its pinnacle in Kemet over 5,000 years ago. And what we know as a fact is that African people in the Nile Valley were the first human beings to divide the day into 24 hours. They created the calendar that we currently use now, the calendar of 365 and a quarter days. That calendar was developed as late as 4,230 BCE, and it is still in use today. African people within the Nile Valley, which includes Sudan or Kush, Ethiopia, and Kenya, is all part of the great Nile Valley River system, which was a cultural highway where people, concepts, and ideas navigated from the upper south to the lower north. And Kemet, or Egypt, has been the byproduct of all of the greatness of African people. We know that the alphabet, the first system of writing, began in the Nile Valley, the first organized system of agriculture. And with agriculture, the ability of the people to feed themselves, to feed their nation, came the development of geometry to measure the land every year after the Nile floods, taxes, taxing the land to be able to determine the resources that would be at the government's disposal, hydraulic systems to be able to control the flooding of the Nile River. All of this was developed first in the Nile Valley. We also find that Kemet, the Nile Valley, is the origin of the theological systems which have governed the world for at least the past 2,000 years. Judaism, Christianity, and Islam had their foundations, their beginnings within the Nile River Valley. We also have within Kemet the first and oldest government established by African people, ruled by kings and administered by civil servants who oversaw massive civil works projects. They were responsible for designing, constructing cities, temples, tombs, pyramids, and other monuments, which have made Egypt one of the most important tourist destinations in the world. We also have within the Nile Valley the first middle class comprised of technocrats, architects, engineers, designers, artists, psychologists, priests, priestesses, warriors, and merchants, astronomers, people who are responsible for maintaining the longest sustained civilization in the history of mankind. The history of Kemet can be divided into 4 golden ages, 4 periods of profound development. The first golden age lasted approximately 1,000 years. That was the period in which all of the pyramids were constructed. The second golden age lasted approximately 257 years. That is when all of the great literature, the philosophical texts, the spiritual texts, the wisdom texts of the ancient Nile Valley were written during this time frame. The third golden age lasted approximately 480 years, and that is when Kemet became a nation, an imperialistic nation, where she was forced to expand her borders in order to prevent invaders from coming in. And this is the period in which many of the temples and monuments of Kemet were built. The fourth and final golden age is the period in which Africans from Kush came in and ruled Kemet during and established what we now refer to today as the 25th dynasty. The 25th dynasty is a period in which Africans from Kush came into Kemet to restore the land of her ancestors. And these Africans were responsible for initiating the first Renaissance in recorded history. And they ruled Kemet for approximately 75 years before their reign came to an end. And then the Persians came in, then the Greeks, then the Romans, and the Arabs have been controlling Egypt for the past 1,373 years. So here is a slide which gives you a pictorial representation of the rulers of ancient Kemet, and it makes a profound distinction between Kemet and Egypt. Kemet is an African word which means the nation of the Black people and not the Black land. Egypt is a Greek word which describes one temple in one city. So most of the names that we use to describe African people, places, and things have been changed by non-African people. Case in point, Egypt is a Greek word. Sphinx is a Greek word. Pyramid is a Greek word. So part of our objective is to use indigenous African terms to describe African people, the things that they did, the things that they created, so that we can have a better understanding of who these people were and what our capacity is as their descendants. So here we see actual images created by kings of the first, second, third, and fourth golden age, when Kemet was the most powerful nation on the planet. Here we have the beginning of European control and domination of Egypt through the Greek and the Roman period. This is when Kemet became Egypt, and the Arabs came in and ruled Egypt, conquered Egypt in 648, and they control Egypt to this very day. Here is another example of this pictorial representation, which shows you a clear distinction between Kemet and Egypt. Kemetic civilization lasted from 3200 BCE to 332 BCE, when the Greeks came in and conquered Kemet. And so we have to clearly be able to make a distinction between African rulership of lands in Africa and African rulership of African lands by non-African people. Those distinctions are so critical to us telling our story and rescuing our history. The most important work that I've done in my life has been the 13 years that I've spent involved in organizing, fundraising, and participating in the AHSA Restoration Project, where we started off 13 years ago excavating 3 tombs, and now we have 8 tombs that we have discovered and are in the process of restoring, and we plan to open this site to the general public in 2025. Here is an aerial photograph that was taken of the primary tomb that we are restoring. This is the tomb of a Kushite priest by the name of Karak Amen. We have excavated over 2,700 tons of debris, which is equivalent to 5,400,000 pounds of debris. And in the process of excavating and removing this debris, we found over 34,000 fragments, which we're now using to rebuild this temple tomb. So this is profound work on just one of the tombs that we are currently restoring in an area known as South AHSA, which is on the west bank of Luxor, Egypt. We have made some incredible discoveries over the past 13 years. One of our biggest discoveries was made last fall, when we found this pyramidion that proves that there was a Kushite pyramid built on top of one of the tombs that we are currently restoring. We had an exhibition in the Luxor Museum. The exhibition opened on December the 12th of 2020. it commemorated the 45th anniversary of the Luxor Museum, and we displayed the Pyramidion, which is the capstone of a pyramid, in the Luxor Museum. This is our third consecutive exhibition in the Luxor Museum. We have done one exhibition a year for the past 3 years, showcasing the profound discoveries that we've made at our site. Now, what has been significant for me was a discovery that I made on September the 28th in 2016, when visiting some tombs about 2 miles away from where we're currently excavating, visiting a 25th dynasty tomb and a 26th dynasty tomb. I made an observation which blew my mind, in that I saw painted on the ceiling of two 2,700-year-old tombs this image, which you in Ghana will recognize as the Akoma Sankofa symbol. So I've been able to trace the origins of that symbol to East Africa, and more specifically, the oldest representation of this symbol has been found in Kush, now modern-day Sudan, going back to at least 1800 BCE. So this discovery has excited me for various reasons. The most important reason being that there's been research done by West African scholars, Cheikh Anta Diop for one, and a colleague of Cheikh Anta Diop, Abubakar Lam, who wrote a book entitled Paths from the Nile. And in this book, he put forward information documenting 6 migrations of African people out of the Nile River Valley into the Niger River Valley in West Africa. In other words, what we can now begin to document is that Africans from Kemet and Kush began to move from the east to the west with their cargo of knowledge, where they helped to jumpstart culture and civilization in West Africa. We've been able to trace these migrations to the Dogon in Mali, to Senegal, where there are similar practices among the Wolof. We have been able to provide find examples of the migration of Kemetic kingship patterns among the Akan in Ghana, other spiritual practices among the Yoruba in Nigeria, and among other groups in the Cameroon. So this is opening up a new area of discovery, a new area of research for us. And what our goal is, through the work that we're doing through the AHSA Restoration Project, is to train the next generation of Egyptologists so that they can continue this research and further document the migration of African people, history, and culture from the Nile to the Niger. So where does that leave us? It leaves us to a new theory that I am working on, and that is the migration of African people from the Nile to the Niger to the Potomac. So you're in Ghana now watching this presentation, and we know that African Americans, a large percentage of African Americans were taken from Ghana, were taken from Senegal, were taken from Cameroon, were taken from Nigeria to the southern states, to Brazil, to the Caribbean. And so we've been able to, through the works of African ancestry, trace our DNA back to West Africa. And what we're now beginning to conduct more research on is the further migration of Africans from East Africa to West Africa, and then ultimately from West Africa to the Americas. We're now looking at scientific evidence, genetic evidence, as well as cultural evidence, which will reinforce this migration of African people and knowledge across the continent and across the ocean. So we are literally standing on the threshold of ushering in new knowledge, new historical knowledge about African history and culture, which we are now packaging and passing on to younger people, so that they will now, as they attend elementary school and high school, they will now have a greater understanding of who they are, the culture that they have inherited, and what they have the capacity to do. So my daughter is going to build on this knowledge transfer in her presentation, where she's going to talk about our cultural imperative program, a program that we've had in place in California and have taken national throughout the United States, and are looking to expand this program internationally. So my daughter, Atlantis Browder, is going to share with you the research that we've done using my first book, From the Browder File, to develop a curriculum for high school students where we immerse them in their history and culture so that they can begin the process of understanding who they are, their place in the world, what they have inherited, and what they have the capacity to create for future generations. So at this point in time, I will end my presentation and turn the floor over to my daughter, who will show you what we have built and what we're offering to the African community throughout the world. Thank you very much for your time and your attention. And I'm so appreciative to be a part of this program, to use technology to be a part of this program virtually via this recording while I am in Philadelphia at this moment, honoring a dear brother and dear friend who lived his life bringing glory and power and honor to African people. Thank you very much. I appreciate your attention. Ashe.
All right, so there you have it. That is my father, Anthony Tyrone Browder. And what I will do, just to kind of keep things flowing, I'm going to go ahead and start jump into my presentation, and then we'll use any time that we have left to take Q&A. So let me share my screen and pull up my presentation. Bear with me one moment. All right. Okay, so as my father mentioned, I will highlight some of the ways that we through IKG model the importance of Kemetic studies. But what I do want to do is begin by highlighting a few foundational questions. I was a very inquisitive child, and I think I picked that up from my father, who always taught me to think critically and to ask questions. And throughout my years of education, I think we all can agree that some of the basic questions that we were all encouraged to ask in the process of learning is the who, the what, the where, the why, and the how. And so I use these questions to guide my instruction of others, but I also use it as a part of my learning process as a student of life. And so I want to use these questions to introduce my presentation. And so, in the context of our topic, the questions that we would ask in terms of modeling the significance of Kemetic studies are: who are the role models? Who are the individuals who are teaching this information? What is being modeled? All right, that is apparent through the topic. But when and where does this modeling take place? Why is it important, and how is this space created? So for me, it's important to kind of cover these questions. As I mentioned, of course, we know what the topic is, but it's just as important to know who are the individuals who are responsible for delivering this information and the setting, why it's important, and how we create that space. And so I'll start with the first question: who are the role models? Our role models can look or serve as leaders, as educators, as scholar activists. Um, Role models come in many different forms, but the most important thing for us to be mindful of is what role models truly are. Role models are individuals who are serious and committed to a lifelong process of learning and teaching others. And so for my father, his role models were Dr. Clark, John Henrik Clark, Asa Hilliard, Ivan Van Sertima, John G. Jackson. And so coming up under my father, those have also become my role models as well. But my biggest role model is my father, and I'll share a little bit more about his impact on my life. However, as role models, it's truly important for us to understand that we all have opportunities to teach others, but the only way, or it's important for us to at least remember that the only way we can teach or pass information down is for us to learn it. We can only teach what we know. And so, as parents, as grandparents, as leaders, as educators, as scholar activists, it's our duty and responsibility to learn and study so that we can teach the next generations, teach them how to think, how to write, how to speak, how to research, how to become jegnas or defenders of our culture. And so this process is an ongoing cycle, and it's really important for us to understand how we can maintain this cycle, which is through education, culture, and tradition. And it's also important for us to understand that um, serving as a role model, serving as a role model is necessary for both youth and adults. As my father alluded to earlier, there are many adults who are not aware of our true history and culture, and so we are all in positions to learn, and it is necessary so that we can become self-aware and, most importantly, liberated. And so, the last point that I want to make with regards to the who is uh, developing a new perception of what it means to be a role model or what a role model looks like. I know for me growing up, role models were generally elders or adults. But as an educator, I've learned to understand that children can also serve as role models. And I've had an opportunity at an early age to be a role model to my peers as well as to adults. And so when we look at this new perception of what a role model can be, it also includes the cycles or stages of life. We have the elders, we have the adults, we have the children, toddlers, and infants. And so as an educator, I always made it a point to teach my students that they are role models. They don't have to wait until they become adults to model what is important for our people. And even infants and toddlers, the way that they interact and engage with each other is all predicated by what is modeled for them, how they're taught to interact with their peers and others around them. And so this is an important, all of these positions are very important in the process of education. And I also learned early on the importance of each one teach one. I believe there was a session yesterday that focused on this topic. And I was first introduced to this concept um, and learning about Nelson Mandela when he was imprisoned at Robben Island. And this was a model that they used, each one teach one. There were many adults who may not have been literate, but what one person knows, they can teach others. So whether it's within the same age group or different age groups, elders, adults, and children, we all play an important role in this process of education. And what it also speaks to is community involvement, because that's also something important that we need to work on, developing intergenerational relationships. And we can certainly do this by expanding our understanding of what a role model is. So the next component, the when and the where. When does the modeling take place? Where does the modeling take place? There are at least two specific times when we can teach this information. Of course, we think of the traditional setting of education in the school, um, but we also have to be mindful of teachable moments. We can teach formally through textbooks and papers and handouts, but we can also use our surroundings to help teach young people and adults about Kemetic history and culture. And a great example of that is the statues that my father shared. And so those who understand architecture, art, and symbolism know that there's so much knowledge and information that can be gathered through our surroundings by studying symbolism and architecture that reflects our history. And so the where, again, of course, we associate learning with school, but one of the things that my father taught me is that education begins in the household. Our parents are our first teachers. So, in addition to the schools, in addition to our homes, communities, community organizations, places of higher education, such as Cape Coast University and many other universities around the country and the world. Organizations such as the Association for the, I'm sorry, organizations such as the association that sponsored this event and many other organizations and events such as PANAFEST. And so the why will highlight that. Um, in the next couple of slides, but the last question is the how. How is this space created? And so that can be perceived through at least two different means. So when we in terms of creating this space, we look at how we work with the children to deliver this information, but we also have to be mindful of the physical implementation of creating such spaces. And so, as an educator, one of the most important things that I learned in terms of creating a space where we can teach this information is that we have to build or rebuild the foundation. And sometimes, before we can just jump into the history, we have to help young people develop a sense of values, cultural values, moral values. And so as we begin to build upon that foundation, we move into literacy, teaching them, as I mentioned earlier, how to think, how to read, how to write. And then as young people grow older and become more skilled, then we could begin to introduce more advanced information, whether it's with history, culture, economics, or politics. So, in addition to that, it's also important that we are mindful of teaching the whole child. Sometimes, as an educator or as educators, we tend to focus just on the intellectual development of youth. But it's also important that we focus on their emotional growth, their emotional well being. It's also important that we focus on their physical well-being. As a result of working with inner city students, what I realize is that many of our students come from backgrounds where they may not have the support at home. They may not be eating. They may not be receiving the things that they need to develop physically in life. And so, as a teacher, I used to have snacks in my class. Children would come to my classroom hungry, and I recognized, how can a child focus on learning anything if they are still hungry? So whether it's their physical well-being, emotional well-being, or spiritual well-being, these are important elements that we also have to include as we are developing the mind and intellect of young people. And then the last component of how we create this space in terms of physical implementation, oftentimes we need money. And that's one of the biggest challenges that our people often struggle with, getting the money to create or implement models where we can teach young people African, or more specifically, Kemetic history and culture. And so, of course, unless people in the community are willing to volunteer their time and do it for free, we know that people do have to survive. They have to make a living. So we have to find that balance where we can commit and dedicate time to the next generation to teach them and to mold them. But we also have to recognize that money, finances are very helpful with this process. So I just wanted to just kind of highlight those basic questions because they are just as important as what we're being modeled or what the models are that we use to teach Kemetic history and culture. And so, um, as I mentioned earlier, my father was my first role model. He was um, my Jegna. And one of the ways that he first introduced me to African history and culture was by one, taking me to all of his lectures, to presentations and workshops where I had the opportunity to not only learn from him, but many other scholars, such as Dr. Clark, Asa Hilliard, and others. And so, in addition to that, my father took me on my very first trip to Africa in 1989 when I was 7 years old. And after going on that trip, we returned, and a family friend of ours just suggested the idea to write a book, for me to write a book about my first trip to Africa. And that is a project that my father and I committed to executing. And one of the primary reasons why we decided to write this book is because we knew that many of our people don't know this information. They don't know about their history prior to slavery. But in addition to that, many of our people may not have the opportunity to travel to the continent. And so, through my experiences, through my books, young people as well as adults can learn their history through the eyes of someone who looks like them. So, my first book is about my trip to Egypt. And since the age of 8, I've had the opportunity to travel around the country and around the world, teaching young people and adults about their history before slavery. And my second publication, Africa on My Mind, Reflections of My Second Trip, is about my journey to West Africa, to Ghana, Senegal, Gambia, and the Ivory Coast, where I learned how our ancestors got from Africa to the Americas. And so it's always important to find that balance. You know, people talk about history being the most painful aspect of our experience, but that doesn't mean that we have to omit that. So as much as we focus and learn from our experiences through enslavement, we have to find that balance to understand who we were before we were enslaved. Last year, I released my latest publication, which is Reflections of My First Trip to Africa. And so in this book, I revisit some of the narrative from my very first publication, but I also uh, share what I've learned over the years as I've traveled to Kemet with my dad. I believe he's at 61. He's made about 61 trips, 60 or 61 trips to Kemet. So I'm still trying to catch up. I've made about 13 or 14 trips, but I continue to travel with my father because every time I visit the continent, and specifically Kemet or Egypt, I'm always learning something new and seeing something with fresh eyes that I may not have seen before. And in addition to those experiences, I also share my involvement and work with my father through the AHSA Restoration Project. So these are three books that I encourage adults, educators to purchase for their students, parents to purchase for their children to begin building their libraries. One of the first things my father taught me growing up is that um, if you have more CDs, DVDs, movies in your household than you do books, you're going to have problems in your household. And so we have to help young people, especially as technology is becoming big and kids are playing video games and they're on social media. We have to help them find the balance between social media, but also getting back to the basics and reading books. And so, what I'm going to do now is use the remainder of my time to highlight the cultural imperative program. This is one of the many things that, or many models that we use to teach the importance of Kemetic history and culture, not only to youth, but also to adults as well, to help them develop or expand their historical consciousness. So this program was developed around 2017. It's evolved over the years. When I became involved in 2019, I came on board as the national director. And so our program expanded from just being implemented in the state of California to now being implemented around the country, in New York, in Florida, in Texas, in Louisiana, and many other cultures. And so we want to continue to expand this program, and hopefully one day we can reach the continent or other places around the world. And so the Cultural Imperative Program is specifically designated for high school students. We have had a few sites that have allowed middle school students to engage in this information, but the purpose of the Cultural Imperative Program focuses on two primary things, which is to help increase the cultural awareness of young people as well as help them to increase their critical thinking skills. And so, of course, those skills are essential um, to academic success, but of course, they're also necessary when it comes to navigating our day-to-day life. And then, as my father mentioned earlier, why it's important for us to develop a foundation of cultural awareness, because it is a way for us to transform our consciousness, to transform the way we think, to transform the way that we behave, so that we can have a greater impact, not just on our families, but the community and future generations to come. And so these are some of the outcomes for our program. I won't go over all of them, but I do want to highlight just a few, which is that we truly focus our attention on highlighting the value of reading and learning, particularly about African American history and culture. And so um, we all know, or some of you all might have heard the saying, if you want to hide a secret from a Black person, put it in a book. Um, Reading is something that we have lost, but we are working to kind of move back towards that in many different ways, but we have to teach children the value of reading. And reading is one of the many ways that we can expand this muscle that we call our brain, so that um, we can work and exist on a higher level of consciousness. So, of course, through through the reading and through the learning, what we're hoping to have the students develop is self-awareness, self-determination, and personal accountability. So, through our program, there are many different ways that we model the significance of Kemetic history and culture. So,
Sorry, Sister Atlantis. Can you speak just a little bit louder?
yes, yes. Let me make sure my volume is up. So I was saying, one of the ways that we have, um, one of the ways that we're teaching Kemetic history or the significance of Kemetic history and culture through this program outside of just a book are by different elements of the program. So something as simple as the expectations or the behaviors of the students. This is a way in which we have been able to introduce the 10 virtues, which Georgian James referenced in his book Stolen Legacy. This is also an opportunity to introduce the principles of the 7 principles of Ma'at: truth, justice, balance, harmony, order, reciprocity, and righteousness. So this allows us to go back to what I mentioned earlier, is kind of rebuilding their foundation and helping them to develop morals and values which will sustain them as well as those around them and their community. Another element in our program is another element in this program is having the students recite the CIP pledge. This is something that the students do at the beginning and at the end of the program. This works on a number of different ways, but even on a subliminal level, having the students recite this information, repetition is important, is another way of helping young people learn. And towards the end of my presentation, I'll share with you all or read the poem, which provides a narrative and a foundation as to our experience as African people, and reminds them of their obligation to honor their ancestors and continue their legacy, as well as create their own legacies. As my father mentioned, the program is centered around his first publication from the Browder File, 22 essays on the African American experience. For our first year, these are the essays that we pull from the book. And over the course of 5 months between January and May, we have the students read this book. We also use a curriculum which I developed when I came on board, using my experience as an educator to find engaging ways to help the young people interact with this information. And I'll give you all one example. The CIP curriculum includes activities, independent activities, cooperative group activities that allow the students to reflect on the subject matter that's discussed during the day and reinforce key concepts. And so I wanted to share with you all one example um, that we incorporate into the program. And this is something that I brought from my experience as a teacher. For those of you all who are educators, ELA teachers, or history teachers, you might have heard of something called a Socratic Seminar. And this is a process in which you have students come together, sit in a circle, and have a discussion about a particular topic. In this case, we discussed um, and this particular activity was related to the essay creation of the Negro. And so this activity allowed students to talk about the use of the N word, Nigga, the origin of that word, how it's used to hurt us in many ways. But this activity I named or renamed Jehudi Seminar. So as some of you may already know, that much of Greek history and culture was borrowed or stolen from Kemetic or Egyptian history and culture. And so it's important that we recognize the historical figures that our young people are introduced to in education, and find um, uh, a different way, a cultural way of seeing the same individuals, or learning about other figures in history. So Jehudi, who is a Kemetic nature that represents divine thought, speech, and writing. So this activity is to honor and recognize the characteristics associated with that nature, so I won't take the time to read the text that's on the screen, but through this process of engaging in a Jehudi seminar, it truly allows students to engage in a way that they've never done before. Because one of the most important things that we teach the students through this activity is respecting others, respecting people's opinions, even if they differ from yours, teaching young people to articulate themselves, how to think through what they're trying to say, and to be able to deliver it in a way that can be received by others. But this activity, in and of itself, really encourages the students to be mature, to use. To be mindful of the words that they use. So when they don't agree with someone, instead of disrespecting them or calling them out their name or bashing them, they learn to ask questions such as, why do you say that? Why do you feel that way? And so again, the whole purpose of the Jehudi seminar is to help the young people engage in intelligent, intellectual conversations about topics that are important to our people. And so, as you see here, this is an image of the Sankofa bird. This is from the cover of my second book. And so, throughout the CIP program and many of our other activities, what we are encouraging young people as well as adults to do is to engage in the act of Sankofa. And so I'm quite sure that many of you all on the continent are familiar with the concept of Sankofa, which means that it is not forbidden to go back and reclaim your past. And as Dr. Clark teaches us that all history is a current event, the past determines your the present determines your future. And this has really been important for me to highlight for young people. As a history teacher, at the beginning of the school year, students will always tell me, "Oh, Miss Browder, I hate history. History is boring." And so I always made it my goal to help young people find ways to connect with the past and understand how the past impacts the present and the future as well. And so, in the process of engaging in Sankofa and studying a variety of information, right? Because, when we think about studying the past, we study the history of our ancestors, but for what purpose? Our purpose is to know, to understand what they did, how they attacked certain challenges, whether or not they were successful, but to learn from the past, to take what works, to take what is relevant and use that in the present in order to move forward in the future. There are things that may not be relevant, but again, it's this process of helping students make connections to the past so they can see how it impacts us today. And so another point that we help the young people to understand in terms of knowledge is that to not know what happened before your ancestors were enslaved. Oops, excuse me. Um, Sorry about that. So to not know what your ancestors, I'm sorry, trying to move this window out the way. So to not know what happened before your ancestors were enslaved is to always remain mentally enslaved. Asa G. Hilliard talked about mental enslavement, and he said that mental slavery is worse than physical slavery because we think that we're free, but we don't realize that the chains are on our mind. And so it's about understanding the ways in which our behaviors and ways of thinking have been guided, particularly by what we do not know. And so I'll wind down with highlighting the Smithsonian Museum of Natural History. This is one of the sites that we take the CIP students on when they come down to Washington, D.C. We do a field trip of Washington, D.C. One aspect of that field trip is called the Egypt on the Potomac field trip, where we take students around Washington, D.C. to show them how the founding fathers of America, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, how they all were aware of African history and culture, specifically Kemetic history and culture, and how they use that knowledge and information to design and lay out Washington, D.C. So in addition to that field trip, we also take the students to the Smithsonian Museum of Natural History. And so if you have an opportunity to visit this museum, you will have an opportunity to learn 4 foundational truths. This exhibit on human origins is a result of decades of research by Smithsonian scientists and more than 150 researchers and educational organizations from around the world. And so the 4 foundational truths that we learn from this exhibit at the museum is that 1, 300,000 years ago, Africans were the only human beings on Earth. And this is not something that we feel, this is not an opinion, but this is something that has been documented through science. 60,000 years ago, Africans left the continent of Africa and populated East Africa. 40,000 years ago, Africans left the continent of Africa and populated West Asia. And here's a map to illustrate that. And then 6,000 years ago, civilization began in the Nile Valley. And so understanding these 4 basic fundamental or foundational truths, what we realize is that Africans are the original man. Every so-called race that we think of today evolved from African people. And so to that extent, the first Europeans were Africans. The first East Asians and West Asians were African people. And so through the study of the Nile Valley and many other areas as well, we're able to help tell many more foundational truths about who we are as a people. And so I'll wind down with this poem, Transition 14. And again, as I mentioned earlier, this is one of the ways that we help to reinforce knowledge of our history and culture through repetition, as well as on a subconscious level. But Transition 14 is as follows. In the beginning, our ancestors knew not. They studied. For 4,000 years, they learned all there was to know. They taught others. Then came the Ma'afa, the great disaster. Enslavers made it illegal for Africans to read and write. They were forced to forget all they had learned and taught. After 400 years of forgetting, they forgot they had forgotten. That changes today. I will remember for them. I will read for them. I will write for them. I will make certain they are never forgotten again. And so even the closing of this student pledge reinforces their responsibility as young people to play a part in this process of educating, not just educating themselves, but thinking of ways that they can educate others, their peers. And at some point they will become parents, and it will be their responsibility to pass this information on to their children. And so I'll close with a short
This moment is here. I can't believe it. It's been a long journey. Mr. Browder has done a lot of amazing work. She stood up and said, I don't want this generation to have to wait until they're 60 to learn what all you Browder scholars have learned. And so she said to Mr. Browder, do you do anything with young people?
So the time that you all spent reading the Browder file, reading the essays in the Browder file, and writing the reflection papers, that time was designed specifically to undo all the efforts to destroy your mind. And what I want you all to understand during the 2.5 days that we have is that here in DC, the most powerful nation on the face of this planet was a city that was built by the descendants of the same hands that built the pyramids. The same hands that built the pyramids built the Capitol, built the White House, built the Washington Monument. And nowhere in DC is there anything that denotes what our ancestors did. So your salvation, our salvation, lies in us knowing who we are and affirming that within us so that we can use the resources that we have available to us to empower us. And that's what this weekend is all about.
pour this libation in honor of our ancient ancestors, mothers and fathers who were the parents of humanity, culture, and civilization. We acknowledge them for existing, and we say Ashe.
Ashe.
So if we don't tell our story, nobody else will. Nobody else will. Nobody else will. Nobody else will.
All right, so that's CIP. And, it's really been a blessing to be a part of the Cultural Imperative Program because it allows me to see how young people, the different ways in which we can transform the mind of young people. So I'll close with my last slide and a quote, which is that we are the vessels through which our ancestors breathe, speak, and do their best work. Our contact information is at the bottom. Our website's the asarestorationproject.com to learn more information about the excavation work that we're doing. If you are interested in any of our publications, you can visit our website at ikg-info.com. And I will stop sharing my screen so that we can take a few moments to answer questions. Thank you for your time and your attention.
All right, let's thank Atlantis for her presentation. Thank you very much. All right, we have time for maybe 2 or 3 questions before our time is up. So do we have any questions in the chat already? I think I saw some. Let's see. Vern is put something there.
Let's see. Atlantis, your father.
Let's see if I can get my screen to move.
Okay, I can see the question. I can read it. Um, says Atlantis, your father mentioned AfricanAncestry.com.
Okay, so Atlantis, your father mentioned AfricanAncestry.com. Have you or your father had your DNA? Have you or your father had your DNA analyzed?
Yes. So my father, through AfricanAncestry.com, got his maternal and paternal DNA tested, and it was traced to Nigeria and Cameroon. And so through African Ancestry, one of the beautiful thing about using their service is that for me as Tony's daughter, his results also reflect my results as well. So the only thing that I would need to do for additional information about my ancestry is to research my maternal side. And that was something that I did do a number of years ago. And I'll share this with you. I don't talk about it often, but I was um, somewhat disappointed. That was probably one of the most disappointing feelings that I felt in my life when I received the results for my maternal um, ancestry. And so through my maternal ancestry, there was no African DNA. So it means that going back, the the mother or great grandmother, going back several hundred years, was a person of European ancestry, and so that was a moment that I had to obviously experience, and it really forced me to consider some other things. But what I realized is that many of us, because of enslavement, um, we do not have quote unquote pure African blood, and so regardless of what our DNA results are, we do know that science um, has ultimately shown us that all people evolve from an African man and a woman. And even I think it was um, Thomas Jefferson. I'm blanking. It's either Thomas Jefferson or Abraham Lincoln who.
Can you speak a little louder?
So I was saying, I believe it was either Abraham Lincoln or Thomas Jefferson um, who created the one drop rule. So if you have one drop of African blood, then defines you or qualifies you as an African. So we all have, mixed background and mixed ancestry. But what's most important to understand is that of all people throughout history, African people and indigenous people have been omitted from history. And so, as my father taught me, as he learned from Dr. Clark, that we have to, that just as important as it is to study African history, it's also important to study world history so that we can find out what our connection is to other cultures and other histories around the world. So that's the long answer to your question.
Are there any questions from the audience? Okay, no. There's another question in the chat. Have you or your dad viewed Great Pyramid Cave 2019? If so, what is your take on the theory that the pyramids and statues were made by moles melting granite using solar energy?
Okay. Um, so I have not seen um, that documentary or movie. I'm not sure if my father has, um, but what I can say specifically about statues that I've seen on my various trips to Kemet, specifically when we visit um, Aswan in Egypt. There's a site that's referred to as the site of the unfinished obelisk. So obelisk is the Greek word for Tekken. So one of the most popular Tekken or obelisk is the Washington Monument, which is found in downtown Washington, D.C. And so, visiting this site in Aswan at the site of the unfinished obelisk, we had an opportunity to see what would have been, gosh, I can't recall how many stories, but at least a two-story Tekken that was unfinished because it cracked. But when you go to the site, you can actually see how they were carving this structure um out of block out of various types of stone. So I do know for a fact that many of the statues um were carved, and I can't necessarily speak to the molds or melting granite, not to say that that's not possible, but at least what I've seen through my eyes and the evidence is that many of the statues and other architectural elements were created um, through our carving them out of stone.
And we have time for one more question.
So I see someone in the chat said that they themselves and other homeschooling parents would be interested in knowing if we offer any online virtual classes for our youth. Um, so I will say two things. This year, or actually last year and this year, has been an interesting experience for both my dad and I, and for many other people around the world, pivoting to a virtual platform. And so that has been, of course, challenging in some ways, but it's been very beneficial in many other ways, in that we can offer this information to people who are all across the country. And so my father, last over the past year, he's done two different courses or sessions where he works specifically with adults, teaching them about Nile Valley history and culture, or the origins, African origins of Christianity. And I do know that in the fall, he will be, either in the fall or the spring of next year, that he will be doing additional sessions that focus on the same subject matter. And as far as virtual classes that I offer, I also have been using Zoom and this virtual platform to reach young people. This past summer, actually spring, I did a three-part series, a three-part book discussion for middle school students. And what was interesting is that we had elementary, we had middle, and even high school students. And regardless of the age, all of the students were able to walk away with something. So that virtual book discussion Is something that I also plan to do again in the fall. But I'm also open to meeting with homeschool students, educators, and other individuals to make this information available.
Just because it's Mama Nabantu, I will take this last question. She snuck one in on us. This is absolutely the last one. Have you learned about the major role of Kemet women, discoveries of astrology?
So I personally have not um, done research on that as it relates to astrology. So I'm not sure if you have information that you can share. Um, but most of my knowledge, particularly about some of the women in Kemetic history, obviously we know the most famous ones, Hatshepsut, my namesake Queen T or Queen Tai, and so most of my knowledge at this point is more so as them um, serving as rulers of Kemet, um, or as wives of rulers of Kemet.
Thank
But
you.
yeah, and I will just say that that doesn't mean that, of course, astrology is not present in some sense. And I don't know if we have time. We don't have time to go into that. But we do know for a fact that 5,000 years ago, um, the Egyptians were aware of at least 5 major planets that are part of our solar system, and were also aware of the idea that celestial bodies have a spiritual and physical impact on human beings here in the physical realm. So that is something that we know exists, but I cannot speak to women who focus on that particular area.
All right, so thank you again for presenting on behalf of you and your father. We really appreciate it. We always learn so much from you and your father, and we wish you continued success in your work. And we look forward to getting all the updates as they become available on your archaeological work in Kemet, and also what you're doing with young people in the schools. That's also a very powerful thing that you're doing to continue to spread our history and knowledge around the world. So thank you so much for your work. Thank you, Nana Kofi, as well, for your presentation on the Akan spirituality system and how it has one of the ways that it arrived in the U.S. through Nana Parabia. We wish you also success on your 50th anniversary celebration in November. We have tweeted on that, and we have been showing the same slide that you have through the conference. So hopefully we'll get some people to attend who have also joined us here at PANAFEST. So I know in the US it's maybe 12:30, 1:30, but here in Ghana it's 5:30 p.m. We are going to go on break now for the rest of the afternoon. There is an evening program that we plan to live stream on our Facebook page. And also I think the university is also live streaming on UCC uh, Facebook. There will be some films shown. I don't have the names, but I know that there's a intention to show some movies um, in the auditorium. So we will be doing more things this evening, continuing to bond and build bridges. What is the name on the Facebook page? Can one of you type your Facebook page in? Yeah, So they'll type that in the chat for you. And AHSA's Facebook page, let me see if I can get that for you. I think it's African Heritage Studies. Yeah. So at African Heritage Studies. Any final comments or anything? If not, we are going to leave the room and go on break till this evening. All right, y'all stay black. All right, Obadale, I hear you.
Asante sana. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Yes, Baba Naj, thank you, Madasi. I think I saw Nana Nketia. Is he still here? Maybe he left. But Baba Kwame Zulu and some of you have been here with us all day today. We truly appreciate you hanging in here with us. Obadale, you have been with us all day today as well. So thank you so much. And we enjoyed your presentation as well earlier.
Nana Nketsia just said,
Charles is
still here.
Asakile.
Nana
Sorry?
Nketsia is still here.
Oh, he's still here. Okay. I didn't, oh yes, he is. There he is. Greetings, Nana. Can you turn on your video so we can see you? Do you want to say any parting words for today? I'll put you on the spot.
I'm learning so much. And I'm being fed by all kinds of African food. So at the end of the day, I'm sure that I'm going to be a better African than I am already. And I thank everybody for their major contribution.
All right, y'all have a great day. We're out. Tomorrow is the big day for us. We are having our roundtable on the significance of Dr. John Henry Clarke. We'll be doing a book signing. I'll be signing, and then we'll have a roundtable as well. Dr. Jeffries will be with us. Our president, Ife Williams, will be on the roundtable, and some of our other members who are here. And then there's going to be a colloquium on the future of PANAFEST immediately following the roundtable. And Nana Nketia is the keynote speaker tomorrow on the contributions and significance of Dr. John Henry Clarke. So please join us. Tell your friends, everybody to tune in. We start at 10 GMT, which is 6 a.m. Eastern. But as I mentioned earlier in the day and yesterday, we are going to do our best to start replaying some of the presentations a little later in the evenings so that, you know, US time, so people can see them. And hopefully we'll start that tomorrow before the end of the colloquium. But we also have other events throughout the week. If you've seen our agenda that's on our website, we have the Women's Day at PANAFEST on Thursday. We'll be participating in that. And we will be visiting Nana's Village on Friday. And we have Queen Quet from the Gullah Geechee Nation who will be speaking to the youth there. And then we have some sessions on Friday and Saturday looking at transportation and water infrastructure issues with large youth participation to talk about and see what their vision is for developing the infrastructure in Africa and taking those issues forward. in an African-centered way, but also in ways that help to talk about job training and creation of careers and jobs for them in the infrastructure area, which many of the youth said that's what they want to talk about when we asked. All right. Have a good evening. Have a good day.